So this is a quick talk about what we're calling workers. So it's more of an advertisement for Feature Friday this week, which is going to be about this. So a couple of weeks ago, Rob gave a talk about splitting out different parts of the server. So we talked about splitting out the task runner or orchestrator component and splitting out maybe a thing we're going to call edge and splitting out these things we call workers. I shamelessly stole these slides from Rob's slide pack from that day, but unlike him, I'm not witty enough to put in a cool title or subtitle. So my talk about workers is just called Workers. Sorry about that. So what am I talking about? So here's the world as it sits now. So the Octopus server has got inside of the scheduler and the task runner. And then when we run a run on server step, what we actually do is we invoke Calamari locally on the server. We monitor its execution and collect the results from it, and then the task runner grabs those results and keeps doing what it was doing. And this works really well for sort of those run once, I just want to run this script things. But there's a couple of problems. So for example, run on server does what it says, which is it runs on the server. So that's arbitrary code running on the same account as Octopus is running on the machine that it's running on. And this can have all kinds of implications. So for example, in the testing the other week, they picked this up that you can, because you're running arbitrary scripts, you can escalate your permissions and do all kinds of fun stuff. And it's not been a problem, basically because Octopus runs in a trusted environment. External users can't use this to gain access to anything. It's developers and people who deploy the software who are already trusted. And so no one's trying to do anything nefarious, but there's also the option of a bug in a script could, muck something up on the server or crash the server or ruin some part of the file system or something. Or even, so for example, the other week when that person deleted Donald Trump's account on Twitter on their last day at work, you could do the same sort of thing here. On your last day at work, you could deploy something to production that you otherwise didn't have permissions to deploy. So there are some holes there. As well as that, we also can't control what resources these steps use, and so we can't load balance them and scale them as nicely as we'd like. And they're also not isolated between deployments. So two different deployments running at the same time, running on the same file system, access to the same stuff, and you could easily tread on each other as they're working. And also then users don't have control over when and where their resources are being allocated. And then as we scale up to hosted and enterprise, this sort of gets worse because you want to segment people's abilities a little bit nicer than having one point where everything just comes back to being on the server. So you can get around this a little bit. So for example, some people run pet tentacles instead of running on the server. So they have a tentacle in the environment that's got a special role. And then they run their run on server tasks on that tentacle. And that works as well, but you still can't scale it. You've only got one of them. If you tried to have two pets with the same role, your task would just get done twice. So if you want to have multiple things happening, then you've got to start having multiple roles for each pet, and you've got a fair bit of intricate organization to do. And then you can't do the run on behalf of role step as easily in that option. So what we're thinking of is allowing tentacles, so just ordinary machines, to be what we'd call workers in a deployment. So a machine can get tagged as a worker for a particular role or tagged in a particular environment, and then run on server becomes run once on some appropriate worker. So instead of a run on server step, you get a run on or a run once step. And at runtime, then when we're orchestrating the deployment, we pick an appropriate worker, run it once, get the result back, and continue with the deployment. So in that case, the server then doesn't branch between running something locally and running a normal deployment task. Everything is just orchestrating something on a tentacle, and it's the selection of where you're running that's slightly different. So for a normal deployment step, you're running it on all the deployment targets that match that particular role, whereas for a run once step, you're picking a particular worker and just running the task once. And so this allows for all kinds of nice things. So you could have pools of workers where we pick one particular worker, or if they're running multiple of these steps in parallel, you can sort of scale them out. You can have workers shared across projects, or in your production environment have particular workers that are locked down more. You could tag workers with capabilities and say, oh, this worker's got this capability, so this kind of step should run there, and other steps should run elsewhere. So here's just some examples of how this might look. So for example, I've got these little yellow boxes. The green boxes are just tentacles in some environment, and the little yellow boxes represent I've been tagged as a worker in some way. And so for example, in some environments, you might reuse your tentacles. So maybe some roles are doing a lot more work than others, and you could use the spare roles as not doing much deployment work, so we'll offload some of the run once steps to you. And so in different environments, you could tag them in different ways, and it would work the same way as deployment steps work now, where the changes in a deployment per environment is not a change in what the deployment process looks like, it's a change in what we pick up is living in that environment at runtime. So we pick up all the tentacles that we're deploying to, and at the same time, we pick up the machines that can act as workers. And so you could reuse your tentacles as workers, but you could also, for example, in a production environment, you could have a pool of workers that act just as workers and not as tentacles, and not as deployment targets, sorry. And similarly, you might want to have a pool of workers that everyone uses and then particular workers for production. Or you might have workers with particular capabilities that all the environments share, and you pull a worker out of that pool for each deployment. For example, to a particular environment, you might be pulling workers from some of the pools, but not others. And that works a bit like lots of other things where you've got things with capabilities and you pull the capabilities and use something out of that worker pool. So to achieve this, so the run on server steps become like a run once step. So we might have a step, maybe something like run once, and that would run once on any worker in the current environment, maybe, or run once on a particular kind of worker. So any worker with this tag in the current environment, and then you run once for each role steps. Similarly, run once for each role on a particular kind of worker. So workers get assigned tags in an environment, and then we collect those and find a suitable worker at runtime. So here's the sort of endpoint, what this might look like once we've split out the scheduler and web API and the task runner and edge, and then workers are just tentacles. So they might be deployment targets in the environment where people are deploying to, or they might be just machines that are acting as workers. But the important part is they're not living on the server, not living on the task runner anymore. So they no longer have access to the task runner's file system. They don't have direct access to the database. They can't stomp on each other as easily. So all the communication to and from workers is over Halibut, which isolates the workers from each other, as well as isolating the workers from the actual server itself. So there's the problem of what do we do for small installs, or what's the default option? And so I think Rob talked the other day about, well, we could, when we've got this idea of task runners that we might be able to scale up and scale down, for small installs, we could just have a default where there's just a task runner that's kind of attached to the server and scheduler. And we'd want to do the same sort of thing with tentacles to minimize the amount of work you need to get Octopus up and running, and also to minimize the change for people who already run things on the server and are quite happy with that and don't want to go installing worker tentacles and things. So we need a good default option for that. In terms of what we need to do, so we need to be able to tag workers or tag things as workers. We need to change the run on server step to be more like a run once somewhere step. And then we need to change the deployment process to select a worker, or to identify the potential workers and select a worker from the pool of potentials. So most of that sort of already exists. We already do a similar step to that in deployments. We look at the environment and find all the targets of a particular role, and it's the same sort of process, but implying it in a different way. So we have lots of bits that look a bit like this. So it's more massaging than completely new things. Later on, we might want to be able to do things like dynamically provision workers, or during health checks or something, detect what capabilities they do have, and then users don't have to tag their workers in the same way they would for particular capabilities, but all that stuff comes a little bit later on. The only real ouch point is the extra friction for installs and upgrades. If we're going to run workers or run on server steps in a tentacle as a worker, then that's different to how people install and use the product at the moment. So we might have to have something like an option where it just works out of the box and they don't have to install a new worker. So we could do something at first where we don't require the workers, but you've got an option, and then maybe move people towards installing tentacles on their servers for the workers. But that's something for discussion. So that's just an overview of what workers might look like and how people might use them. And for the details, Feature Friday this week. So come along and discuss. And that's all I had. So if anyone's got any questions, happy to answer them.
Hey, just a couple of really cool questions. I think that all sounds really good. That sort of sounds like it fits in well with how we've kind of all been talking about for a while, so that's good. Minor question. So when we talk about run once on a worker, I know a couple of users have asked about being able to run like n number of times. Would that be I'm assuming that wouldn't be a big issue to go in that direction?
Yeah, so I don't think so. So this step where we select a pool of workers from some set of potentials. So at the moment in a deployment step, if we're deploying a package, we look at the environment, find all the tentacles that match the role, and then we just deploy to them all. And so the step that we're going to use for this would look really similar, is look at the environment, look at all the things that are tagged as workers, and then select one. And so a naive implementation could be just pick the first one or pick a random one. But then you might want to get more serious about it and, think about which ones are actually already doing work or which ones are, some sort of scheduling or planning in your deployment. But you could also, instead of just picking one, you could pick N. It doesn't change the next step, which is the running and orchestration of those steps. So that would just be a change to how we pick the things. So yeah, I think that could work.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another one, you kind of touched on it around the discussion on capabilities, but again, like it came out of the discussion we had with Derivco. Have we thought about the ability to provide some sort of affinity? So, for example, between some pool of workers and go, well, I know this project, when this project gets deployed, I want it to only go to this pool of workers, or you might want one that's specifically for, or would you just use environments to manage that, do you think?
Yeah, I was thinking environments and tags could do that.
Yeah,
you can always tag a machine multiple times, I guess. So a machine could be tagged as. I'm trying to think of an example. Yeah.
Makes sense. So would you see these workers in the infrastructure view, or would that be kind of like a separate drill-in view for all your workers?
So I was proposing that in that infrastructure page where we've got the boxes, that maybe there's a box for workers.
Yeah.
Well,
and it just represents all.
Yeah, and then when you see that page, you'd see the different environments and what's a worker in those different environments.
Cool. And then presumably when we need to do upgrades for like the latest version of the Tentacle or Calamari or whatever, that just gets pushed out when a deploy occurs?
On the worker machines? Yeah, we'd have to... I guess we'd have to do something like that, yes. So one of the problems with workers and their capabilities and things is it'd be really nice if we could upgrade the workers as well. If you could have a project that upgraded all your workers to the latest version of the tool set you'd like your workers to have or something. So it would be nice if we could use the tags that workers are worked with also as deployment targets or something as well, and treat them in the same way as we treat all other tentacles.
Cool. That sounds good. That's just all implementation details, I suppose. The general structure, that looks good.
But I think in the end, your points about resources and how we tag resources and things that you had in the specs repo, that sort of stuff eventually, maybe using that sort of thing for tagging your workers and
sure. Yeah, makes sense.